See a lot of misuse of the word empirical, though I'm not going through days of what is now thousands of comments on this video about um, why black women have said they would choose a white man over a white woman at work, why they feel safer around him than around us. And the phrase that was circulated right after women choosing the bear was, white women are the men of women. Quote I learned from White Woman Whisperer on here. And my comments are a mix of the exact behavior that I talked about in my blog or genuine curiosity from white women. Black women are sharing their experiences. So let's dial back to undergraduate research methods 101 for a second, because sadly that is not information that's accessible to everyone due to classism. For something to be empirical, it is something that could be derived from experiment, observation, experience. It is not from theory or logic. I'm seeing a lot of logic in the comments, and I've made videos before on how the fallacy of objectivity is used to dismiss a lot of harm. And in social science, there are typically about 4 different designs that we think about: descriptive research, correlational research, causal comparative, quasi-experimental research, and experimental research. I think a lot of people conflate empirical research with experimental research. This is where you have an independent variable that you can cause an intervention and change. For example, these are the studies that are where you give someone in one condition a resume that has a white name, and then in another condition you give someone a resume that has a non-white name, and you see if they rate it differently. Not everything can be assessed like that. But for example, a lot of age research is quasi-experimental, where you look at people in different stratifications of a variable like age, because you can't change someone's age. Correlational research is a lot of social science research. Things that we know there's relationships between them, but we're not sure what is causal. And hopefully you can prove them in an experimental research someday, but that's not always possible. You can look at, for example, that people with certain characteristics are related to having higher stress or lower stress. Like, for example, there's a lot of correlational research on correlations between living in poverty and having very high stress. That's hard to prove in an experimental way because you can't put someone in a room and remove them from poverty and compare them to a room where they are not in poverty. Descriptive research is also very common. It is the state of what things are. And that is what a lot of the research that the commenter referred to about women's situations. We can think of this as the state of the wage gap, stats of violence against women, etc. There is also qualitative research, which I'm a huge fan of because I think it makes quantitative research much better. Because if you administer quantitative research methods without having any qualitative knowledge, you can provide quantitative measures that don't even capture what the experience is. So for example, in my research on the unwritten rules of work for people from working class backgrounds, I started with interviewing people from different backgrounds and different races and different genders, because otherwise if I had just gone straight into a survey, I wouldn't even know what to put on the survey that wasn't my own experience, and there wasn't a lot of literature at the time for me to pull from. Doing the qualitative data first gave me a broader, richer knowledge of unwritten rules and allowed me to then develop a measure in the quantitative data. So to know which method to use, you have to know what research question you're asking and what criteria you're looking for. In the statement about white women are the men of women on slide 2, I explained that that was a phrase that was coined after the man versus bear situation online, and that black women said that they would choose a white man over a white woman. If you are looking for a literal experiment of that particular question, I am not aware of one. Now, did women need any descriptive data or correlational stats on if they would choose a man or a bear to understand why that scenario resonated with women? No, because they know of the other data on violence against women, rape, all those other things you mentioned in your comment that are reasons why they would choose the bear. So similarly, we can look at other data on women of color and white women's experience to realize why their scenario of choosing a white man over a white woman might resonate. There is plenty of empirical research of multiple kinds on white women and racism. And since we know that this is real, we can apply it in other situations. Historical data is also important to remember here, because you can't put history on in a control versus an experimental group, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And you could say, well, white men didn't support the black women's movement either. Yes, but I think a key difference is that white men don't come back to black women every few years after ignoring their rights until usually reproductive rights are on the ballot, and then try to say, but we need to sit together, we need solidarity. So the statement is never said white women are more privileged than white men. There's a privilege in that white men don't ever seem to have their rights on the ballot. But why black women might say we're the men of women being the qualifier, there seems to be substantial evidence of that.